Hi, I'm Dr. Bart. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us here today. Our topic for today is medical data. Now, this has become a huge field and had tremendous growth over the last few years. Who are some of the folks who are involved? Well, first of all, we've got HEOR, Health Economics and Outcomes Research folks, PMS, Post-Market Surveillance, we've got RWE, Real World Evidence, Real World Data, we've got medical researchers, physicians, payers, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, hospitals. This has become an absolutely huge field over the last few years, and it's extremely far-reaching. Now, these folks have a large array of jobs and functions, some of which might include assisting in actual collection of the data. In some cases, some of these folks might actually go out into the providers' offices to assist in data collection. Once data has been collected, some of these folks might assist in actually entering the data into databases or spreadsheets or some type of tool that we can use for analyzation. Then they might assist in actual analyzing and processing of the data. Another key function they might assist with is assembling materials that help convey the results of the analysis of the data. And a final function they might be involved is actually delivering the message of the materials and the analyzation out to the healthcare providers, payers, and other key stakeholders. So companies are relying more and more heavily on these key outcomes personnel to convey the message of the success and the efficacy of their products to key stakeholders in the marketplace. So let's take a minute and let's look at the landscape of this whole medical data arena. Today, more and more, both providers and payers are under all-time high pressure to be able to demonstrate the value and the quality of the treatments that we're performing. In today's complex data ecosystem, as we'll call it, it's both difficult and expensive to pool and gather all the information together that we need to prove safety and efficacy of the care that we're providing. And the pressures, stresses, and frustrations are just going to continue to grow as the payment models shift from traditional fee-for-service to new value-based care models. Now, these new payment models with value-based service are becoming more and more complex because they actually require tying cost, services, and outcomes data seamlessly. Now, we're all aware of the ever-increasing rises in costs of healthcare. An interesting study by the Center for Study of Drug Development recently stated that pharmaceutical companies on the average are reporting that to bring a drug through the entire R&D process, from inception to clinical studies to approval to actually launching the drug on the market, the average cost now is over $2.6 billion. $2.6 billion to bring a new drug or medical device to market. So there's extreme pressure on medical device and pharmaceutical companies to be able to prove safety, efficacy, and the value of the care, and that their products are truly providing best treatments. And to meet this increase in demand, a recent publication by PharmaForce International from earlier this year stated that pharmaceutical and medical device companies on the average have increased their field-based HEOR personnel by over 53% in 2016 alone. In 1 year, over 53% increase in the size of their force. So this medical data arena is proving to be far-reaching and a very high-impact field with considerable effect on cost, safety, efficacy, finances, reimbursement, and the overall effect it's having on healthcare delivery as a whole. So now that we've reviewed the landscape of this medical data arena, let's take a look at the actual methods or the variety of types of medical data collection that we have and a few of the challenges that each one of those present. Now, one of the first methods that we have for data collection would be clinical trials. Clinical trials is where we're using scientifically controlled evaluation of a medical device or product on consenting human beings or a test subject group. And typically, these clinical trials occur before approval and widespread use of the product. Now, the challenges with clinical trials are going to be actually the control group itself. It's a fairly small group, and we see only responses on those individuals that were selected to participate in that group. So when we expand and when we have widespread distribution of a medical device or product, we can begin seeing many new factors or perhaps things that weren't revealed to us to that group of test subjects. So clinical trials are certainly extremely valuable, but also has that limitation that looking only at a small group and what happens when we distribute out to widespread use can sometimes be different. Another type of data analysis and evaluation method that we have would be claims-based. Now, claims-based is basically taking CPT and ICD codes and evaluating information based purely on the codes. The challenge here is basically the limitation of only things that are paid for. So in the case of our ICD codes, we're collecting information at the high level of the diagnosis, but frequently in clinical practice there's a lot more granular detail that we need that actually gives us greater information about the progression of the disease or of the pathology, and just looking at the ICD code we have no way of gathering any of that information. Similarly with the CPT codes, we're limited there with treatments that have a specific CPT code unique to themselves. Frequently we group a number of different treatments in under the CPT code, so we have no way to parse those out to determine what's most effective. Same with our HCPCS codes. The exact same process. Not every medical device, not every item that we might want to look at has its own unique HCPCS code. So in this case, again, we're losing the granularity of being able to tell an issue we might have with one manufacturer's medical device versus another manufacturer's competitive medical device. So we're very, very limited, and we lose the granularity that we really need for solid clinical evaluation of the treatments and diagnoses. Another method of data collection that we have are longitudinal studies. Now, these are collecting the same information and variables on a particular disease process, but over a long period of time. And these are excellent at telling us information about a disease process over a prolonged period of time. However, the biggest issue with this is tracking. As a clinical practitioner for over 18 years, I can tell you that frequently patients are lost to follow-up, so tracking and keeping those patients within the particular group to be evaluated becomes a major challenge to overcome. Another type of data collection and evaluation that we have is real-world evidence or real-world data evaluation. This is typically conducted by the post-market surveillance folks. And with these folks, what we're really doing is expanding beyond what we learned during the clinical trial phases, and we're gathering information about how a product, drug, medical device actually responds once it gets into much more widespread use. And as we mentioned previously, the issue with the clinical trials can be that we're looking at a very small controlled group, and when we introduce out into widespread use, what new information can we gather? We can see different types of information. Sometimes new products can show either new uses that are very, very valuable, or once in a while we start seeing side effects and issues that we didn't see previously under the small controlled group. So here, one of the real issues with real-world data and real-world data evaluation becomes not so much the quantity, because we can gather huge amounts of information, but it becomes much more the quality of the data that we're obtaining, because it comes from so many different sources. Now we start running into issues with standardization, controlling variables. Again, it runs into not a quantity, but a quality control issue with this particular type of data collection. Another type of data collection evaluation would be the registries. Now, registries are very good because they're collecting basically diagnostic information based on the ICD codes. some CPT code, some treatment code information, but primarily focused on ICD and diagnostic information. And here again, we're seeing massive amounts of information, but we run into the issue of, are we really getting the granularity that we need to really give us good predictors on the progression of disease states and disease processes? Another type of data collection evaluation that we have are enterprise data warehouses. These are basically huge repositories of data and information. Now, they require that providers or someone upload the information to those facilities. So that's one limitation, is number of people actually participating and providing them the information. And then once they have this information, now we see that we do end up collecting a huge array of data. But the issue becomes, it's so much data that it's difficult to work with because there's no standardization, no baselines. It's just a massive amount of data that we need to determine how's our best way to process this and standardize it so that we can really perform appropriate statistical evaluation on that very large amount of data. Yet another form of data collection and evaluation that's becoming more and more popular today is medical big data. Now, this has a great name and it's becoming very, very popular. And this is basically where we're collecting huge amounts of data from a huge number of sources. So the upside here is we're seeing massive amounts of data that can give us a tremendous amount of good information to track disease processes and treatments and all the things that we want to track and evaluate. The challenge has become kind of threefold that we really identify with this particular source. Number one is triangulation. With triangulation, we're getting a large number of data put in from many different sources. And as we do this, the challenge becomes no standardization and no structure. So we're getting a massive amount of data, but it makes it, since it's from so many different sources, it becomes very difficult to manage from a statistical evaluation perspective. Another challenge to this particular type of data collection is missingness. So typically there might be a data field where there's no value. And using a very simple example of perhaps patient improvement. So if there's no value, does that represent that this patient had no improvement, they were no better, no worse? Or does that empty field represent that this patient, perhaps that just wasn't evaluated on that particular day? So how do we interpret this field that's missing? Were they not included that day? Were they not seen that date? Or does it represent a true zero improvement? So there's interpretation of a particular field that may be lacking information. So it becomes a challenge. And a final is what we call cursive dimensionality. And that basically refers to just almost too many variables to handle. Since we're receiving so much information, there's a non-standard format, it becomes very, very difficult to manage all the different variables, and it really starts to challenge our evaluation to statistically evaluate using the big data methodology. Another method that we have for data collection evaluation are surveys. Now, surveys can be performed in several different manners, in person, online, group discussions. So there's a number of different methods that we can use to collect these surveys. And the survey can be performed by a number of different people. The healthcare team, either the provider or staff. It can be performed by researchers, PhD candidates, medical and physician liaisons. So there's a number of different people that can actually perform the survey. But ultimately what we're trying to get here is patient feedback. And patient feedback is going to be subjective, so it's about their personal experience, which is really a critical piece of our puzzle. It's a critical piece of information because what we're really trying to determine is what is the patient's perception of the treatment and the experience that they received, one of our most critical components. Now, some of the challenges involved with survey, there can be many, but a few of the top ones would be, number one, finding participants. Particularly if it's not the healthcare provider, if it's a medical researcher, frequently finding participants for the survey can certainly be a challenge. And once we find those participants, then we run into a number of other issues. For example, trust, completing the medical survey, and accuracy of the data. And let's look at each one of those a little bit. Number one, completing the surveys. We all know patients necessarily are always in a hurry and don't particularly want to take the time to complete a survey for us. So actually getting a patient to complete the survey can certainly be a challenge. And then there's the accuracy of the data. As I mentioned, that's tied to trust, particularly if this person is administering the survey is not their healthcare provider. If they're not familiar with this individual, then a number of questions can come to the patient's mind. Number one, privacy, security of my data, particularly if it's more sensitive topic, can certainly affect our accuracy of our data. Other challenges that can affect surveys would be the patient's perception of the individual administering the survey. Do they feel that there's someone they can trust? And do they feel that they're going to be someone who's going to protect their privacy? There can also be just personal issues of the patient or the individual taking the survey. Were they hungry? Were they thirsty? The temperature of the room, was it too hot, too cold? All these factors have been determined that they can alter the accuracy of the data that we actually are able to receive and obtain during the survey process. And a final type of data that we'll discuss here today is going to be clinical data or data from the actual medical record. Now, since this is going to be data that we're going to actually pull from the healthcare provider, and the healthcare providers have more in-depth training and greater scientific knowledge and understanding, this data is going to be some of the best for statistical evaluation. Now, there are two different sources for physician charts that we can obtain data from. First would be either paper charts or electronic medical records. And with paper charts, we're all familiar with the challenges we run into there. Number one, the real challenge is purely obtaining the information in the first place. It requires either someone going actually out onto site, either digging the information out there, making copies of records and taking it back to a workplace, or perhaps the staff at the office needs to send mail, fax, send the data to a place to be evaluated electronically by some method. So pure collection from a paper chart becomes very challenging. And then there's other challenges that we run into: no standardization, reading the physician's handwriting. Of course, we're all familiar with that challenge. And all of it becomes very difficult to obtain and difficult to work with paper charts. The other method would be electronic medical records. Now, electronic medical records eliminate a tremendous amount of that. Since everything is already in a system, now electronic transmission to either an evaluator or to a company to be evaluated becomes a much simpler, much more straightforward process. Within the electronic medical record, there's a number of different fields that are very simple and very straightforward. For example, most of the patient demographic information is extremely well standardized among systems in this day and age, so that information can be very easily extracted from an EMR system today. But the real place where the medical record becomes so valuable is actually in the clinical data and the clinical information in that chart or that medical record itself. That really has the granular details that we need and that we're really seeking for the best outcomes studies. And we run into the same challenges collecting this information, regardless if we are on paper or electronic records. Number one, participation. I can speak as a provider in private practice for over 18 years. Finding providers that are willing to participate in studies certainly can be challenging. Frequently we're working as hard as we can just to get through our day and having to take on the additional work of filling out more surveys, filling out additional paperwork, the required responses that a company might want to glean from a particular study. Certainly has its challenges, and it may be a project that perhaps the physician is challenged to try to participate in. So finding willing participants certainly can be a challenge. Additionally, completing those forms. Again, sometimes the provider may give you part of a form and then they got too busy to complete the rest. And so, again, very difficult to get providers not only to participate, but actually complete forms that we may present to them. And then additionally after that is who actually goes out on the site to actually collect this information. Typically, companies have outcomes personnel, perhaps medical or physician liaisons that might actually go out on site to urge the doctor and the providers to complete whatever medical forms or information we need to try to collect the data that we're looking for appropriate evaluation. But again, who is actually the person and who is the individual who actually goes into the office and tries to actually help us collect that information? Another challenge. And one of the greatest challenges we run into, even with electronic medical records, is that every provider typically will build their own templates. And every provider that builds their own template, they've completely introduced all their own variables and all the data in their own format. So now the issue becomes that we have non-standardized, completely unstructured data with so many variables that it becomes difficult to even track. This type of data becomes very difficult for meaningful statistical evaluation. It becomes very difficult to work with. So now let's take a minute and let's tie together these last two very valuable sources of data collection and data evaluation, the survey and the clinical information from the medical record. Now, the survey is, of course, going to give us very, very valuable information. It's going to be subjective information. It's going to be all about the patient experience, which is critical. One of the greatest details that we're trying to find out is what is our patient's feelings and interpretation of the services and the treatments that we provided. So that is critical information. But some of the challenges is going to be a complete lack of standardization. I know, again, as a provider for over 18 years in private practice, I know that all patients don't have that same baseline. So trying to establish a standard or a baseline with our patients, even with a guided survey, becomes very challenging and very difficult. But this information that's subjective in nature about the patient experience is extremely valuable to us. Now let's contrast that to the data that we'll pull from the medical record, the clinical data. This is going to be much more scientific, much more in-depth, much more objective information that we're pulling. So when we combine these two, the subjective information from the patient and the objective information from the providers, we really need to try to find a good way. Some of the terms out there are mixed data sources. And this is a very good example of that, where we're actually combining the subjective information from surveys with the clinical information, the objective detail from the providers to get a more full, well-rounded, in-depth picture of medical outcomes. So, giving a quick review, we looked at a number of the different methods of data collection and evaluation. We looked at claims-based and registries, and we determined that although giving us good information, they're limited to anything with an ICD or CPT code. And that really doesn't give us the granular layer that we would like to see. We talked about real-world data, registries. We talked about data warehouses and medical big data. And all of these are excellent to give us huge amounts of data, but the very fact that they're completely unstructured, no standardization, and so many variables that it becomes overwhelming, all of these factors make statistical evaluation and meaningful evaluation of the data that we pull very, very difficult to achieve. The last methods that we looked at, patient surveys and the electronic medical records, both of these provide excellent data again. We see that there's issues with standardization, unaccounted for variables, and unstructured data. So when we evaluate all of these methodologies, although all are very good and very promising, we see that there's kind of an underlying theme or kind of an underlying thread that we continue to see, which will be lack of structure, unaccounted for variables, and lack of standardization. All of these things make statistical evaluation and meaningful evaluation very difficult using those methodologies. So we'll be working on strategies to try to overcome these challenges for quite some time moving forward into the future. So we've talked a lot about the problems and the challenges, but it's never good to focus on problems in life. it's always much better to talk about solutions. So if we were going to build a system or a method of data collection that solved many of these problems, what would that system look like? Let's talk about that and evaluate that for a minute. So let's pose a few questions. What if there was a system where surveys were completed by the patients and clinical data was entered by healthcare providers actually at the provider's office? This would certainly eliminate the issue of participation and completeness. All data would be completed by, or surveys would be completed by patients. All data that was important and relevant would be entered by healthcare providers, so participation and completeness would no longer be an issue. And what if there was a system that utilized completely standardized, completely structured data with all variables accounted for? So then those variables could be either added or deleted to determine their effect on the overall data set and the outcome. This would certainly take a tremendous amount of pressure off of all of our study design team. In our existing systems today, if the study design team doesn't anticipate all the appropriate questions, then they just don't get answered. But having the ability to add and delete all variables at will would certainly take a tremendous amount of pressure off the study design teams. And what if this data was being collected real time and could be obtained and retrieved from any remote location across the entire country? This would certainly free up our outcomes personnel, so they would no longer have to actually go out on site to try to help us collect data, but instead we could redirect those folks conveying the results and the messages and showing best treatments to payers and key stakeholders. And finally, what if then the data that's retrieved from the system could be either obtained and analyzed by the company, so it would be raw data coming back for the company to analyze, or the system could even assist in analyzation and statistical evaluation of that data. So, does such a system exist? Starwriter assists HEOR and post-market surveillance teams, medical researchers, healthcare providers, pharmaceutical and medical device companies to obtain and statistically analyze structured clinical data using the Starwriter patented process. All this proves safety, efficacy, and advanced evidence and value-based medicine. After this video, you have the opportunity to schedule an appointment. Don't wait. Need more details on exactly how Starwriter can assist you and your company. I'm Dr. Bart. Thanks for spending some time with us here today. And we'll talk soon.